Hello, my name's Andy Revell and I'm the Executive Director of the HIV Resistance Response Database Initiative, or RDI. The history of drug therapy for HIV infection is a tremendous success story. Today, with combinations typically of 3 or more HIV drugs, we can suppress the virus to undetectable levels for considerable periods of time. So provided patients take their drugs when they're supposed to, and that if the drugs fail, an intelligent decision is made about the next regimen to use, patients can expect a near normal life expectancy. Unfortunately, treatment does continue to fail in certain patients. Typically, this is because of non-adherence. The patient doesn't take the drugs every day, or they forget a few doses. And this lets off the pressure on the virus and enables the virus to develop resistance to one or more of the drugs. If this happens, then in well-resourced countries, this is detected very quickly because we monitor the level of virus in the bloodstream very regularly. And if the virus becomes detectable in the bloodstream, we know the drugs aren't working optimally, and therefore we have to make a decision about which drugs to use next to re-establish that suppression of the virus. In order to decide which combination of drugs to use next in cases of treatment failure, then again, in well-resourced settings, such as Europe or North America, then typically we run a resistance test. This is a test that reads the genetic code of the virus and detects where that genetic code has mutated. Those tests need careful interpretation, and there are complicated sets of rules to interpret the point mutations and tell you which drugs the virus may be resistant to and which drugs the virus may still be sensitive to. The shortcomings of this approach of resistance testing are that there are several different interpretation systems that people use, and they don't always agree in the way they interpret different point mutations. Secondly, the test will only tell you which drugs the virus may be resistant to or sensitive to. They don't give any quantitative estimate of the relative efficacy. And thirdly, the tests are unable to give you a prediction of how a combination of drugs as opposed to a single drug may perform. The challenges of managing treatment failure and selecting the next best combination of drugs to use in a setting that has limited resources are quite considerable. In such settings, not all the drugs will be available. Certainly the latest, more expensive drugs may not be available, so your choices are limited. In addition, the resistance test or viral genotype test, that's generally unaffordable in most low to middle income countries. And in some settings, even monitoring the level of virus in the bloodstream, the viral load test, is unaffordable. The way that HIV therapy is being rolled out and monitored in resource-limited settings, in light of these limitations to drugs and diagnostics, the main approach has been one of a public health strategy. So patients are usually started on a set combination of 3 drugs, and if those drugs fail, they move on to a set second combination of drugs. So there's no individualization of the therapy, really. People are just following the protocols. And once 2 lines of therapy have failed, then often people are rather on their own. And with a limited set of drugs available to them and no resistance tests available, then selecting the next best combination of drugs can be really very challenging. The RDI's concept is essentially to take the experience of hundreds of physicians treating tens or hundreds of thousands of patients and using computers to try and distill all that experience, all the successes and failures and the lessons that can be learnt, and make that wealth of experience available to an individual physician making a treatment decision for their individual patient. The way we do this is that we collect lots of different types of data from HIV patients being treated in clinics all over the world, and we train computer models to use that information to predict how any individual patient will respond to any combination of HIV drugs. The really encouraging thing is that we're working with leading HIV and AIDS clinics all over the world, and they all contribute the data that we need to train our computer models. And to date, we have information on over 150,000 patients in more than 50 countries worldwide. And that enormous amount of treatment experience enables us to train models that are not only very accurate in predicting how patients will respond to combinations of drugs, but those predictions are also very generalizable to patients from different settings, different countries. We've tested our models in numerous studies using independent data, data from clinics that have not contributed to the training of the models. And the accuracy of the RDI models at around 80% is significantly better than the accuracy of using a genotype with rules-based interpretation to predict virologic response to HIV drugs. Typically, we find resistance tests are about 60 to 65% accurate, compared with 80 or even 85% from the RDI models. The RDI has developed models that can make their predictions with 80% accuracy without the need for a resistance test, the so-called genotype test. And these models use a range of other information to make their predictions, including the treatment history, i.e. the HIV drugs that the patient has been treated with in the past, plus a recent viral load, plus a recent CD4 count. And we're constantly researching different variables to try and optimize the accuracy of the models. If a patient and their physician do have a resistance test available, then we would always suggest they use that in the RDI system, because we also have models that include that information in their predictions. And generally, they are a few percentage points more accurate than the models that do not use a genotype. But it really is only just a few percentage points. And in recent studies, our models that do not require a resistance test have not been significantly different in their accuracy from those that do. One of the potential issues with this approach is that one could, in theory, develop computer models to predict responses to therapy using data from a single hospital or a single country. And you could develop models that were quite good at doing that, but they may not be as accurate for patients from a different hospital or a different setting or country. And we've made great efforts to collect data from the widest range of settings as possible. We have data from more than 100 clinics around the world, more than 40 or 50 countries. And that means that in the independent testing that we've conducted of our system, the models have proved really very accurate for a wide range of patients from a wide range of different settings. The physician in any country or setting can be pretty confident that the predictions they will receive from the RDI system will be accurate for patients in their particular clinic or setting. The models that we have developed at the RDI and now make available, they all go through rigorous independent testing with independent data from clinics not involved in the training of those models. In addition, we have conducted a prospective open clinical trial of the system as a whole, where we had expert HIV physicians with patients who were failing on therapy make a treatment decision using all the tests at their disposal, including a drug resistance test. They then made their treatment decision, and then we gave them the RDI's predictions for alternative combinations of drugs. And once these expert physicians received that report, they changed their treatment decisions in a third of the cases. So we were really quite encouraged that even physicians with enormous experience of treating HIV and AIDS could gain something from the system, and it would have an impact on the treatment decision making that went on. The RDI models are available to anyone free of charge over the internet. They are used to power what we call an HIV treatment response prediction system, HIV TREPS. And this is a clinical decision-making support tool that uses the models to predict responses. And using that system, a physician can obtain predictions of the probability of response to combinations of drugs that they're considering using. Or they can ask the system to predict the response to dozens of alternative combinations of drugs that are in common clinical use around the world, and rank those that are most likely to give you a response. In addition, physicians can put in their local HIV drug costs, so they can add the annual therapy cost to the report that they obtain from HIV TREPS, or indeed model effective alternatives within a certain drug budget. Using these different facilities within HIV TREPS, physicians can really tailor the way they're using the models, and it becomes a very flexible clinical support tool. The RDI models make a prediction of the probability of the follow-up viral load being undetectable, or more accurately, less than 50 copies per mil in the blood plasma. And this is a key target of combination HIV therapy, is to reduce the level of virus to below that detectable limit and keep it there long term. Some of the settings where our system, HIV TREPS, could potentially be of most benefit are those settings where resources are a bit limited, where not all the HIV drugs are available and where all the diagnostics may be unavailable. So where resistance tests are unaffordable, for example. In these settings, making the right selection of the right drugs is absolutely critical, because if you get it wrong, you can run out of treatment options quite quickly. Moreover, it's more difficult to make the correct decision because you don't have a resistance test available. So in those settings, using our system that will accurately predict the best combination of drugs that you do have available can be extremely useful. Our system, HIV TREPS, is currently designed to predict the response to a new combination of drugs for someone whose current treatment is failing. And probably the greatest benefit can be gained from use of the system in cases where the patient has been treated with 1 or 2 or 3 lines of therapy, and there may be some HIV drug resistance there, and the treatment options are beginning to narrow down and become somewhat limited. In those cases, it's critical to pick the best combination of drugs, and that's where HIV TREPS can really be of value. There are a number of distinct benefits that can be gained from use of the system. I mean, obviously, it can reduce the number of treatment failures. So from a patient perspective, it will reduce the likelihood that a combination of HIV drugs won't work for you. And that can improve your clinical outcome. It can also preserve some of the treatment options, because if you make a wrong decision and start a combination of drugs that do not fully suppress the virus, then that's ideal conditions for HIV drug resistance to develop, and then you can begin to run out of treatment options quickly. The third potential benefit in resource-limited settings in particular is that you may be able to find a combination of drugs that is predicted to be highly effective, that is at the same time cost effective. Some of the older, less expensive drugs may be an effective combination, and maybe you don't need to move to the more expensive recent drugs quite so quickly. So thoughtful use of the system can be of health economic benefit as well as clinical and patient benefit. We did a small retrospective study with a treatment centre in India where we looked at the treatment decisions they have made when their patients' therapy failed. And then we ran the data for those patients through the system, and the system was able to identify alternative combinations of drugs with a higher probability of success that were less costly than those combinations actually prescribed in the clinic. And the potential savings were quite substantial. We're talking about hundreds of dollars a year per patient. That was only a small study, but clearly there is the potential to use this system in conjunction with local drug costs to try and develop the most cost-effective treatment strategy for that local setting. One of the key things with our models and the treatment response prediction system as a whole is to keep it current. So we're very reliant on all our collaborating centres, such as the Chelsea and Westminster, to regularly provide us with updates of their data from their patients so that we can develop new models that are able to predict responses to the newest drugs and that reflect the current treatment strategy in operation in various settings around the world. And so every year or so, we develop new models to power the treatment response prediction system. A key to the success of HIV TREPS is that the data we use to develop the models comes from as wide a range of settings as possible. And so we're always on the lookout for new centres, new hospitals from different countries that are able to share their data with us. And so I would really appeal to anybody watching this who's involved in HIV treatment, if you can help us by providing data from your hospital, it will make the models more accurate and particularly more accurate and more useful for patients from your setting. In my 30 years working in the HIV and AIDS field, I've seen enormous change. I first became involved in the field when really AZT was the only drug available, which gave very limited benefits and for a limited period of time. And I became very involved in working with HIV patient support groups around the world and formed great working relationships with people who unfortunately went on to die far too early. Thankfully, those days are now past with the advent of combination therapy from the mid-1990s. That the whole outlook has become much, much more positive. And it really is an incredible story that in, a little over a quarter of a century, we've taken a disease, a viral disease, and developed 20, 25 drugs that are effective against the virus, and are able now to deploy those drugs in a strategy that can suppress the virus and keep people healthy. So it's been transformed and for the better, and it's a real success story and a tribute to all those who've worked in this field.